The letter arrived sealed in black wax, and Lady Alara Winterbourne knew, before she had even broken the seal, that it would change the shape of her life. She did not yet know how completely. She did not yet know that the elegant, anonymous marriage contract folded inside that envelope carried a name she had spent 12 years trying to forget, a name that had once been carved into her heart with the same knife that later cut it out. She did not yet know that the debts crushing her family had not accumulated by misfortune alone, but had been assembled patiently, deliberately, by a hand that had been waiting since before she was born. And she did not yet know that the boy who had humiliated her in front of all the assembled nobility of the realm, the boy whose cruelty had taught her that love was a performance staged for an audience that would always turn on her in the end, had spent every one of those 12 years carrying a wound of his own, one he had never been permitted to show. What she knew, in the moment she broke the seal, was only this. Her father was dying by inches, her family's lands were mortgaged to men who smiled while they ruined them, and somewhere in the fine, unfamiliar hand that had written her name across the top of the page, there was the promise of salvation. She had no way of knowing that salvation would wear the face of her oldest enemy. Winterbourne Hall in late autumn was a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Alara felt it the moment she stepped into the entrance hall, the particular silence of a home holding its breath against ruin, the way servants moved through the corridors with their eyes lowered, as though looking directly at misfortune might cause it to notice them. Her father, the Earl of Marrow, had not left his study in 3 days. She found him there now, hunched over a ledger by candlelight though the afternoon sun still slanted gold through the tall windows, his once steady hand trembling as it moved down a column of figures that refused, no matter how many times he added them, to sum into anything but disaster. "Father!" She set the sealed letter on the desk before him. This came by private courier. No house crest. No name. Lord Winterbourne's eyes, red-rimmed with sleeplessness, moved from the ledger to the letter and back again, as if he could not quite trust himself to hope. He broke the seal with fingers that shook, and Alara watched his face as he read, watched the disbelief bloom into something perilously close to relief. "What is it?" she asked, though some cold certainty was already gathering in her chest. "An offer." Her father's voice cracked on the word. "A complete settlement of every debt against this estate, every mortgage, every note, paid in full, and the deeds released back to our name within the week." In exchange for what? He did not answer at once. He simply turned the letter around and slid it across the desk, and Alara made herself read it, though something in her already understood that whatever waited at the bottom of that page would not be a kindness freely given. A marriage is proposed between Lady Alara Winterbourne and a nobleman of appropriate rank, to be solemnized within the month. The identity of the intended groom shall be disclosed upon the signing of the contract, in accordance with the wishes of his house. In exchange, the whole of the Winterbourne debt, some £41,000, shall be discharged in full. "You would sell me to a stranger," Alara said quietly, "and not even tell me his name." "I would save this family," her father said, and there was such naked desperation in his voice that her anger faltered, though it did not vanish. "Alara, I have tried everything. I have begged, I have borrowed against borrowing, I have sold what little remained that was not entailed. Your brother's debts alone." He stopped himself, pressed a hand to his eyes. "In 6 weeks we will lose the house. Your mother's grave is on this land. Your grandfather built this hall stone by stone. I cannot. I will not be the Winterbourne who let it fall." Alara looked down at the letter again, at the elegant, unfamiliar hand, at the promise of salvation with no face attached to it. What she did not yet know was that somewhere across the county, in a castle she had once considered a second home and now could not bear to look upon even in memory, a man was staring at a mirroring copy of that same contract, wrestling with a decision he had already made and could not now unmake, and that his reasons for making it had nothing to do with cruelty, and everything to do with a debt of his own, one owed not in money but in guilt, carried silently for 12 long years. "I need time to think," Alara said. "We do not have time," her father said gently. "We have 6 weeks, and a wedding, if you consent, takes 4 to arrange properly." She did not sign it that night, but she did not burn it either, and later, lying awake and listening to the old house creak and settle around her like something dying slowly, She understood that this was itself a kind of answer. She signed it 3 days later, in the small parlor where her mother used to do her needlework, with her father standing at the window and her brother Julian pacing behind her like a man walking off a hangover rather than witnessing his sister's sacrifice. "You needn't do this," Julian said, though he had said nothing to stop it in 3 days, and Alara noted, with the particular clarity of the deeply betrayed, that his protest arrived only now. Once her hand was already on the pen. Once refusing would have cost him nothing and consenting would save him everything. Julian's own gambling debts, she knew, though her father did not or pretended not to, made up no small portion of the sum that would soon vanish beneath a stranger's signature. "Someone must," she said, and signed her name. The ink had barely dried when the solicitor, a narrow, soft-spoken man named Mr. Prescott, who had managed the Winterbourne accounts for as long as Alara could remember and whom she had never once thought to distrust, opened the second, final seal that would reveal the name withheld until the contract bore her signature. She watched his face as he read it, watched something flicker there. Not surprise, she would realize much later, but something closer to satisfaction, quickly hidden. "Well?" her father asked. Mr. Prescott cleared his throat. "The gentleman in question," he said, "is His Grace Gideon Thorne, Duke of Ravensmere." The room did not go silent so much as it seemed to fall away entirely, leaving Alara alone with a name she had not allowed herself to think of in 12 years. Gideon. She saw him again as he had been at 15, laughing beside her on the stone wall that divided Winterbourne land from Ravensmere land. The two of them inseparable since the nursery, closer than most siblings, sharing secrets and stolen sweets and a childish, unspoken understanding that they would somehow, someday, belong to each other. And then she saw him as he had been 3 months later, at the harvest assembly, 17 years old and cold as winter stone, standing before the whole assembled county and declaring, in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of that glittering ballroom, that the Winterbournes were a disgraced house built on debt and dishonesty, that his family wanted nothing further to do with hers, that he was ashamed to have ever called her a friend. She had been 13. She had run from that ballroom in her mother's altered gown and cried until she could not breathe, and something in her that had been soft and trusting had hardened into something else entirely, something that had never fully softened again. "No," she said now, quietly. "Not him. Anyone but him. Alara." Her father's voice was pleading. "The contract is signed. The debt is already marked for settlement. If you refuse now, I know what happens if I refuse now." She folded her hands to keep them from shaking. "I simply did not think I would be asked to pay this particular price." What she did not know, could not have known, standing in that parlor with old humiliation rising in her throat like bile, was that Gideon Thorne, in his own study at Ravensmere Castle, had spent the better part of that same hour standing motionless before his father's portrait, staring into painted eyes that had once given him an order he had never forgiven himself for obeying, and that when his own solicitor asked whether he wished to proceed now that the lady had signed, the Duke of Ravensmere had answered, in a voice that betrayed nothing of the storm beneath it, "Proceed. It is the only way I know to make it right." They did not meet again until the formal contract-signing dinner, held at Ravensmere Castle a fortnight later. A dinner Alara attended with her spine straight and her heart armored, determined that whatever else this marriage cost her, it would not cost her the last of her dignity. Ravensmere had not changed. That was the cruelest part of it. The same soaring stone entrance hall she had run through as a girl, the same tapestries, the same particular smell of wood smoke and old books that she had once associated with safety and now associated with betrayal. She kept her chin high as the footman announced her, and she was still composing her face into careful blankness when the Duke of Ravensmere entered the receiving room, and every careful preparation dissolved at once. He was taller than she remembered, of course. They had both been children, but it was not his height that arrested her. It was the stillness of him, a quality she did not recognize from the laughing boy of her memory, as though something in him had been banked down to embers and left to smolder rather than burn. His dark hair was cropped shorter than fashion favored. A thin scar traced silver through one eyebrow that had not been there before, and his eyes, when they found hers across the room, held an expression she could not immediately name. Not triumph, not the cold contempt she had braced herself for, but something that looked almost like grief. "Lady Alara," His bow was correct, formal, giving nothing away. "Thank you for honoring the contract. I was given little choice, Your Grace." She did not curtsy so much as she performed the gesture, stripped of any warmth. "Let us not pretend this is a happy reunion." Something crossed his face, there and gone before she could be certain of it. "No," he said quietly. "Let us not pretend." Dinner was an exercise in exquisite civility stretched taut over a chasm of unspoken history. Alara's father spoke effusively of gratitude. The old Duchess Dowager, Gideon's grandmother, spoke of wedding preparations with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to arranging things exactly as she wished. And Gideon himself said little, watching Alara with an intensity she found more unsettling than any insult could have been. It was only as the party rose from the table that he found a moment to speak to her alone, drawing her, with perfect propriety, a full arm's length of distance maintained, toward the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "I imagine you owe me answers," she replied. 12 years of them. His jaw tightened. "I do, and I intend to give them to you. Not tonight. Tonight is not the place, and you would not believe me even if I tried. Not yet. But I will tell you this much now, so that you do not spend the coming weeks believing I offered for you out of some wish to complete an old cruelty." He hesitated, and for a moment the careful stillness cracked, and she glimpsed something underneath it that looked almost like a much younger boy, frightened and cornered. "I did not humiliate you at that assembly because I believed a word of what I said. I said it because I was 17, and a coward, and my father told me that if I did not, he would see your family ruined by morning." Alara stared at him. "That is a very convenient story to tell a woman you have just purchased." "I did not purchase you." His voice sharpened, though he kept it low. "I settled a debt of honor that has weighed on this house for 12 years, and I offered you the only apology I have ever been permitted to make. Believe it or do not. I cannot make you." He straightened, the stillness dropping back over him like a curtain. "But I will not lie to you again, Lady Alara. Not for any reason." She wanted quite badly to believe him. That wanting frightened her more than his cruelty ever had. The wedding was set for a month hence, and in the weeks that followed Alara found herself, against every instinct of self-preservation, drawn again and again into Gideon's orbit, not by design, but by the simple mechanics of a courtship that neither of them had chosen but both, apparently, intended to conduct with scrupulous correctness. He called at Winterbourne Hall twice weekly, as propriety demanded. He was unfailingly courteous to her father, patient with her brother's barely concealed resentment, and with Alara herself, careful in a way that felt less like performance and more like penance. He did not attempt to charm her. That, more than anything, disarmed her. He asked after her reading. She had always loved history, the old chronicles of fallen houses and rising ones, and he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions on them, arguing gently when he disagreed, listening intently when he did not. He asked about her mother, gone 5 years now, and when Alara found herself, unexpectedly, telling him about the woman's laugh and her love of autumn roses, he did not interrupt, did not redirect the conversation toward himself, simply listened with an attention so complete it felt like being seen for the first time in years. She told herself each time that she would not let her guard down again. She told herself this even as it happened anyway, slowly, in small unwilling increments, the way ice gives way to spring not all at once but drop by melting drop. "You are different than I remember," she admitted to him one afternoon, walking the Ravensmere gardens with the requisite chaperone trailing at a discreet distance. "I hope so," he said. "The boy I was at 17 is not a boy I am proud to have been." "And the boy before that?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "The one who used to steal apples from my father's orchard and blame it on the stable cats?" Something in his face eased, just slightly, the first real, unguarded smile she had seen from him since her return to Ravensmere. "That boy," he said, "has been waiting 12 years to apologize to you properly. I am only sorry it has taken this long, and this contract, for him to find the courage." She looked away, toward the roses, so he would not see how deeply that admission had struck her. What neither of them yet understood was that their careful, halting reconciliation was being watched, closely, patiently, by a man who had waited far longer than either of them for this marriage to occur, and who had no intention of allowing it to become the happy thing it was, against all odds, beginning to resemble. Lord Edmund Castellan had been a fixture of the county's social landscape for as long as Alara could remember. A courtier of considerable influence at court, a man whose smiling courtesy had always struck her, even as a child, as somehow too smooth, too rehearsed, though she had never been able to say precisely why. He called at Winterbourne Hall the week before the wedding, ostensibly to offer his congratulations, and Alara found herself once again unsettled by the particular quality of his attention. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long, the way his questions about the marriage contract's terms seemed to probe rather than merely inquire. "A remarkable turn of fortune for your family," he observed, over tea he had not been quite invited to stay for. "The whole of the Winterbourne debt, settled in a single stroke. One wonders what circumstances led the Duke of Ravensmere to make such a generous offer, after so many years of, how shall I put it, estrangement between your houses." "His Grace's reasons are his own, my lord," Alara said, with more coolness than strict courtesy allowed. Castellan smiled, and something in that smile made the fine hairs at the back of her neck rise. "Of course. Forgive an old friend of the family his curiosity. I have known your father since before you were born, Lady Alara. I have watched this house's fortunes rise and fall with something approaching a father's concern." He set down his cup. "I only hope that whatever brings the Duke to this marriage, it is affection, and not obligation of a more complicated sort." He left shortly after, and Alara stood at the window watching his carriage roll away down the drive, troubled by a feeling she could not yet name, though it would not be long before she understood it perfectly. The night before the wedding, Alara could not sleep. She wrapped herself in a shawl and made her way down to her father's study, drawn by the thin line of candlelight beneath the door, and found him not at his ledgers this time but standing before the cold hearth, a small portrait of her mother in his hands. "You should be resting," he said, without turning. "So should you." She crossed to stand beside him, looking down at the painted face so like her own, the same dark hair, the same stubborn set of the chin. "Father, may I ask you something? And trust that you will answer honestly." He set the portrait down carefully. "Always. 12 years ago, the scandal that broke between our house and Ravensmere. I have only ever known the shape of it as Gideon delivered it, that we were disgraced, dishonest, unworthy of his family's association. I never understood why. What was it, truly?" Her father was quiet for a long moment, his face working through some private struggle. "It was an accusation," he said finally, "that I had falsified accounts belonging to a shared investment between our two houses, a shipping venture, long since dissolved. That I had embezzled funds and attempted to conceal the loss by claiming a false shipwreck. Was it true?" "No." The word came out sharp, wounded even after 12 years. "It was not true. I never proved it was not, because by the time I understood the accusation had even been made, the Duke, Gideon's father, the old Duke Ambrose, had already withdrawn from our friendship entirely, already spread the story through every drawing room in the county. I tried to defend myself. No one would hear it. A man's reputation, once broken, does not easily mend, and I had neither the resources nor the standing to fight a duke's word with only my own." He looked at her, old grief plain on his face. "I never knew who first brought the accusation to Ambrose. He would never say. I have wondered, every year since, who hated us enough to destroy two families' friendship with a single lie." Alara felt something cold settle in her chest. A suspicion with no shape yet, but a weight nonetheless. "Lord Castellan called on us this week," she said slowly. "He asked a great many questions about marriage, about the debt." Her father frowned. "Edmund has always been solicitous." "Has he?" Alara said, and did not elaborate, because the thought forming in her mind was still too unformed to speak aloud, though it would not remain so for long. She married Gideon Thorne on a bright, cold morning in the Ravensmere chapel, before a gathering of both families and half the county's nobility, and if her vows were spoken with more solemnity than joy, at least they were spoken honestly. She had resolved, walking up that aisle, that whatever else this marriage was built upon, it would not be built upon further pretense. Gideon's hand, when he took hers before the altar, was steady, though she felt the faint tremor beneath his composure, and when he looked at her as the priest pronounced them wed, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like relief, as though some long penance had finally been discharged. What she did not yet know, what she would not learn until the wedding night itself, in his private study at Ravensmere, lit by a single lamp and stripped, for the first time, of every pretense of formality, was that the 12-year-old accusation against her father, and the humiliation Gideon had been forced to deliver at that long-ago assembly, were not two separate wounds but a single one, inflicted by the same hand, for reasons that reached back further than either of them had ever imagined. "There is something I must tell you," Gideon said, once the wedding guests had gone and the castle had settled into its late, hushed hours. He had brought her to his study rather than to any bridal chamber, and Alara understood, from the gravity in his face, that whatever he intended to say had been waiting a very long time to be spoken. "I promised you the truth. I intend to keep that promise, though I fear it will not make you think better of me, only understand me more fully. Tell me," she said, seating herself across from him, her wedding gown pooling like spilled cream around her feet. "My father did not die of a fever, as the physicians declared." Gideon's voice was carefully level, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this confession many times and still found it difficult to deliver. "I have believed for 3 years that he was poisoned. I could not prove it, not then. I had only instinct, and the strange, sudden manner of his decline, and a household staff too frightened to speak plainly of what they had seen. But I began quietly to investigate, and what I found led me, eventually, to the accusation he made against your father 12 years ago, the shipping fraud that was never true." Alara went very still. "You are saying the two are connected?" "I am saying," Gideon said, "that my father did not conceive that accusation himself. It was brought to him, fed to him, I now believe, by a man he trusted, a man with every appearance of loyal friendship and every private motive to see both our families weakened. My father was proud and stubborn, and once persuaded of a wrong, unwilling to reconsider it. He believed the accusation utterly. He forced me, at 17, to deliver the public rebuke at the assembly, under threat that if I refused, he would ruin your family through the courts instead, publicly, irreversibly. I chose the lesser cruelty, believing I had no other choice. I have hated myself for it every day since." "Who?" Alara said very quietly, though some part of her had already begun to guess. "Brought him the accusation?" Gideon met her eyes. "I found letters 3 months ago, hidden among my father's private papers, correspondence I believe he kept because some part of him, even in his conviction, doubted what he had been told, and wished to preserve the evidence in case he ever needed to prove his own good faith. The letters are unsigned, but I have compared the hand to correspondence I hold from a dozen other sources, and I am now certain of the author." He drew a breath. "Lord Edmund Castellan." The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. "He called on my father this week," Alara said slowly, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape she did not want to see. "He asked a great many questions about our debt, about this marriage. I am not surprised." Gideon's expression darkened. "Alara, I did not offer for you only out of guilt for the past, though that guilt is real, and I will carry it as long as I live. I offered because when I began investigating my father's death, I discovered that your family's debts had not accumulated through misfortune alone. Certain notes had been quietly purchased and consolidated by an intermediary over a period of nearly 2 years, in a pattern that only makes sense if the purpose was never repayment, but leverage. I believe Castellan has been engineering your family's ruin as deliberately as he engineered the scandal that broke our houses apart 12 years ago. I do not yet fully understand why, but I intend to find out, and I did not want you facing whatever comes next unprotected or alone." Alara sat very still, processing not only the revelation itself but the sudden, vertiginous reordering of everything she had believed about the last decade of her life, the humiliation that had shaped her, the estrangement that had hardened her, all of it built not upon her father's dishonesty or Gideon's cruelty, but upon a single patient malice she had never once suspected. "Why?" she said finally. "Why would Castellan want to destroy both our families?" "That," Gideon said grimly, is the question I have not yet answered, but I intend to. What neither of them yet knew, what would not come to light for another fortnight, in circumstances neither could have predicted, was that the answer reached back further even than the shipping scandal, to a humiliation of Castellan's own, decades old, nursed in silence until it had curdled into something monstrous enough to consume 2 generations. The weeks that followed the wedding were unlike anything Alara had expected of her married life. Not the cold, transactional arrangement she had braced herself for, but something far more complicated. A careful, deliberate partnership between 2 people learning, slowly, to trust each other again, while quietly investigating a conspiracy that threatened them both. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not resent the work. There was something steadying in having a purpose larger than her own unhappiness, and something unexpectedly intimate in the late nights spent with Gideon in his study, poring over ledgers and correspondence by candlelight, piecing together the shape of Castellan's long campaign against their houses. "Here," Gideon said one evening, pushing a bundle of papers across the desk toward her. Bills of sale going back 18 months. Every note against Winterbourne Hall that Castellan purchased, he purchased through an intermediary, a solicitor's office in the capital. But look at the signature authorizing the transactions on your family's end. Alara studied the elegant, familiar hand, and her stomach turned to ice. "Mr. Prescott, your family's own solicitor," Gideon said quietly. "I am sorry, Alara. I know he has served your house for many years." "He has served my house," Alara said, her voice tight with fury she had not expected to feel so sharply, "for exactly as long as it has been convenient for Castellan to have a man inside our walls." She thought of Prescott's face at the contract signing, the flicker of satisfaction she had noticed and dismissed. "He knew. He has known this entire time who my husband would be, and he said nothing, and he has been feeding our ruin to Castellan piece by piece, and I never once suspected him because he has poured my father's tea 1,000 times and called himself a friend of this family." "We will deal with Prescott," Gideon said, carefully, and with proof enough to end his usefulness to Castellan entirely. "But there is something else." He hesitated, and something in his face made Alara's dread sharpen further. "I have found evidence, still incomplete but troubling, that Prescott has not acted alone within your own household." Alara went cold. "Julian, I cannot yet prove it," Gideon said gently. "But the pattern of certain debts and the timing of certain payments, your brother's gambling losses did not merely happen to coincide with Castellan's purchase of your family's notes. I believe your brother has been receiving money from Prescott on Castellan's behalf for some time. Whether he understands the full purpose behind it, I cannot say. But I do not believe his silence, when your father signed my contract, was innocent." What she did not yet know, what would be confirmed only days later, in a confrontation that would leave her question everything she had ever believed about her own family, was how deep her brother's complicity truly ran, and how close it would come to costing them everything. She found Julian in the Winterbourne stables 3 days later, saddling a horse in the gray hour before dawn, a traveling case already strapped behind the saddle, and something in the guilty, hunted look on his face when he saw her told her everything before he spoke a single word. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Away," Julian said, not meeting her eyes. "Alara, you should not be here." "Where, Julian?" He was silent for a long moment, his hands white-knuckled on the saddle strap. Then, all at once, something in him seemed to break, and the whole ugly truth spilled out of him in a rush, as though he had been carrying it so long he could no longer bear the weight. "I owed money," he said. "Gaming debts, more than I could ever hope to repay on my own allowance. A man approached me. I did not know then that he worked for Castellan. I swear to you I did not know, and offered to settle everything quietly, no questions asked, in exchange for small favors. Information about father's finances, which creditors held which notes. When father was most desperate, and least likely to look closely at an offer of salvation." His voice cracked. "I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was helping, not harming, that whoever was buying up the debt only meant to consolidate it kindly, spare father the indignity of a dozen different creditors. I did not understand, until the marriage contract arrived, that I had been feeding information to the very man engineering our ruin. And by then it was too late to undo what I had done." You knew, Alara said, her voice shaking. And you let me sign that contract believing it was chance or fate, or some stranger's unexpected mercy, when in truth you had helped build the trap that caught me. I did not know it would be him, Julian said desperately. I did not know the groom would be Gideon Thorne, I swear it. I did not understand the full shape of it until the second seal was broken and Prescott read his name aloud. And by then, Alara, what could I have done? Confess? And see us all ruined utterly, with nothing left to save? I told myself your marriage was still a kind of rescue, whatever ugly road had led to it. I told myself that made it forgivable. And now you run, Alara said. Now, when the truth is finally close enough to touch, you flee rather than help us end it. I am afraid, Julian said, and for the first time she heard something genuine beneath the excuses. Real fear, real shame. Castellan is not a man who forgives loose ends, Alara. If he learns that Gideon suspects him, that you and I have spoken of this, I do not know what he is capable of. I only know I do not wish to be here to find out. She looked at her brother for a long moment. This man she had loved her entire life, who had betrayed her not out of malice but out of weakness, which was in some ways a harder thing to forgive. Then help us end it, she said. Properly. Come with me to Gideon. Tell him everything you know and perhaps, there is a way to set this right that does not require you to run for the rest of your life. What she did not yet know, as she led her frightened, guilty brother back toward the house in the thin gray light of dawn, was that Castellan's patience had already run out, and that the confrontation she had been quietly building toward for weeks was about to be forced into the open far sooner, and far more dangerously, than any of them had prepared for. The summons came that same afternoon, an invitation, in Castellan's own elegant hand, requesting the pleasure of the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere's company at his estate that evening, to discuss, the letter said, a matter of some delicacy concerning the Winterbourne family's continued good standing. He knows we suspect him, Gideon said grimly, reading the letter over Alara's shoulder. Or he suspects that we suspect him, which amounts to nearly the same danger. Then we should not go, Alara said. If we do not go, he will know for certain, and act accordingly, on his own terms rather than ours. Gideon set the letter down. Better to face him directly, on ground of our own choosing as much as we can manage it, than to wait for whatever he intends to do next. They went that evening, Gideon's own solicitor and 2 trusted retainers positioned discreetly within call, Julian's written confession. Hastily but thoroughly composed that afternoon, sealed and secured with a magistrate known to be beyond Castellan's influence. Alara walked into Castellan's grand drawing-room with her spine straight and her fear carefully hidden, though her heart hammered against her ribs with every step. Castellan received them with his usual smooth courtesy, tea already laid, his smile giving away nothing of whatever calculation moved behind it. Your Grace, Duchess, how good of you to come. He gestured them toward chairs positioned, Alara noted, so that the candlelight fell full upon their faces while leaving his own partially shadowed. I confess I have been troubled, of late, by certain rumors reaching my ear, rumors concerning old accusations, old letters, matters best left buried in the past. I thought it prudent to speak plainly, as old friends of both your houses. Then let us speak plainly, Gideon said, his voice cold and even. I know that you brought a false accusation of fraud against Lord Winterbourne 12 years ago. I know that accusation led directly to my father's estrangement from his oldest friend, and to the public humiliation I was forced to inflict upon my wife when we were both still children. I know that you have spent the better part of 2 years quietly purchasing and consolidating the Winterbourne family's debts, through an intermediary in my wife's own household, for the express purpose of engineering this marriage on terms you believed you could control. What I do not yet know, Lord Castellan, is why. What I intend to learn tonight, one way or another. For a long moment, Castellan said nothing at all. Then, slowly, something in his careful composure began to crack. Not into panic, but into something colder and more terrible. An old bitterness finally permitted to surface after decades of careful concealment. You wish to know why, he said quietly. Very well, Your Grace. I will tell you why, since you have earned the truth through your own diligence, if nothing else. His eyes moved to Alara, and something in his gaze made her skin crawl. Your mother, Duchess, was once the most sought-after young woman in this county. I loved her before your father ever did. Loved her desperately, hopelessly, for 2 full years, before she chose him instead. A man with less fortune and less standing than I possessed, simply because he made her laugh. His voice, when he continued, had gone thin and brittle with old, festering grief. I told myself I would forget her. I did not. I watched her marry your father, watched her grow old and happy in a marriage I believed should have been mine. And when she died, I found I had nowhere left to put 20 years of hatred except into ruining everything she had built in my place. The room had gone utterly silent. Elara felt something cold and sick settle in her stomach. Not fear now, but a kind of horrified pity, to learn that the architect of so much suffering had built it all upon a grief so old, so private, that no one had ever thought to suspect it. You destroyed 2 families, Elara said, her voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere else to go. Because my mother chose to love my father instead of you. You poisoned Gideon's father. You broke a friendship that had lasted a generation. You drove my brother into debt and deceit, and you tried to sell me into a marriage you believed would let you finally control what you could not have. Over a broken heart, 3 decades old. Do not speak to me of poison, Castellan said sharply, the first crack of genuine alarm in his voice. I brought no poison to this house. Whatever befell the old duke, it was not by my hand. Then you will not object, Gideon said very quietly, to the magistrate examining your correspondence and your household accounts, alongside my own evidence and the written confession of Lord Winterbourne's son, freely given this very afternoon. If you are innocent of that particular crime, the truth will bear it out. If you are not. He let the sentence hang, unfinished, in the candlelit air. What happened next occurred with a speed that left Elara's heart hammering long after it was over. Castellan, understanding at last that the trap he had spent decades constructing had closed instead around himself, lunged not for a weapon but for the fireplace, seizing a bundle of letters from where they had been concealed behind a loose stone in the hearth. Evidence, Elara would understand later, of his own crimes, which he had meant to destroy rather than surrender. Gideon's retainers, positioned exactly for such a possibility, were faster. The letters were secured, unburned, before Castellan's trembling hands could feed them to the flames. Among them, when the magistrate examined them 3 days later, was a final, damning piece of correspondence. A purchase 18 months prior, of a rare and untraceable poison from an apothecary in the capital, dated within days of the old duke's sudden decline. Lord Edmund Castellan was arrested within the week, tried before the county's assembled peers within the month, and stripped of his lands and titles for crimes that spanned 2 generations and 2 families. Fraud, forgery, extortion, and, at last, proven beyond doubt, the slow poisoning of a duke who had once called him a trusted friend. Julian Winterbourne, whose confession had proven instrumental in securing the conviction, was spared prosecution for his own smaller complicity, though he would carry the shame of it, Elara suspected, for the rest of his life, a debt of a different kind, one that no settlement could fully discharge. He left, in the weeks that followed, for a distant posting in the colonial service his father had once hoped he might pursue before debt and idleness had swallowed his ambitions, determined, he told Elara before he sailed, to become a man worth the second chance he had been given. Mr. Prescott was dismissed in disgrace. His own smaller role in Castellan's long conspiracy exposed alongside his master's, and the Winterbourne accounts were placed, at Gideon's quiet insistence, under the management of a solicitor of unimpeachable reputation, chosen this time not for convenience but for character. And Elara stood once more in the Ravensmere Gardens, some weeks after it was all finally, truly over, watching autumn roses nod in the same soft evening light that had witnessed the beginning of her strange, unwanted, unexpectedly precious marriage, and found herself, for the first time in 12 years, entirely unafraid of what came next. I owe you an apology, Gideon said, coming to stand beside her, close enough now that the careful distance of their early courtship had long since dissolved into something else entirely. Not for the assembly, I have apologized for that already, and I hope you have begun to believe me when I say I meant it. But for the manner of this marriage. You deserved to be asked, not purchased. You deserved a courtship that began in honesty, not in a sealed contract and a stranger's name. Perhaps, Elara said, considering this. But I find, looking back on it, that I would not trade the manner of our beginning for any other, however imperfect it was. It brought me the truth in the end, about my father's name, about your father's death, about the whole tangled history that shaped us both before we understood any of it. I do not think I would have found that truth any other way. And what of us? Gideon asked, and for the first time since she had known him, there was real uncertainty in his voice, the uncertainty of a man who had spent 12 years believing himself unworthy of forgiveness and had not yet fully accepted that it had been given. Have I earned back what I broke that night at the assembly? The friendship we had before all of it, before the accusations, before the debts, before either of us understood what was truly being done to us. Alara turned to look at him fully. This man who had once broken her heart under threat of his father's cruelty, and who had spent 12 years since carrying a guilt he had never been permitted to set down, and who had, in the end, risked everything he possessed to make it right. I think, she said slowly, that you have earned something better than what we had before. We were children then, Gideon. We did not choose each other, we simply happened to grow up beside one another, and called that friendship because we did not yet know what else to call it. What we have built these past months, the truth, hard-won and honestly shared, the trust rebuilt one careful conversation at a time. I do not think that is something a childhood friendship could ever have given us. I think it is something better. Better? Gideon repeated softly, and something in his face, the careful stillness she had once mistaken for coldness, the banked embers she had learned, slowly, to recognize as a fire that had never truly gone out. Finally, fully unguarded, opened into something warm. I signed that contract to save my family, Alara said, believing I was sacrificing myself to a stranger's cruelty. I did not know I was walking toward the one person in this world who had spent 12 years wishing he could undo the worst thing he had ever done to me. I do not think I would call that a sacrifice any longer, Gideon. I think I would call it the strangest, most unlikely mercy I have ever been given. He reached for her hand, there in the last gold light of the autumn garden, and she let him take it, no longer the enemy of her childhood, no longer a stranger bound to her by ink and obligation, but something she had never quite dared to hope for again. A man who had seen the very worst of what had passed between them and chosen, with everything in his power, to build something honest in its place. Then let me spend the rest of my life, Gideon said quietly, making certain you never regret it. And in the quiet garden, with the ruin of an old enemy's revenge finally, fully behind them, and the whole uncertain, honest future stretching ahead like an unwritten page, Alara Thorne, Duchess of Ravensmere, found that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid to turn that page and begin.